10 little-known facts about Moses. Firstly, Moses implored God to erase his name from the book of life. What prompted such a profound request, and what lessons can we derive from it? This episode took place during the incident involving the golden calf, which illuminates human tendencies to deviate from their commitments to God. It's strikingly ironic that while Moses was atop Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments, the Israelites violated the very first commandment, which mandates that no other gods shall be placed before God. The Israelites' impatience during Moses' stay on Mount Sinai led them to conceive the idea of fabricating a new deity for worship. To accomplish this, they melted down their golden ornaments to forge the golden calf. The people's restlessness prompted them to approach Aaron, asking him to step in as their spiritual leader in Moses' absence. Aaron acquiesced to their demands by molding their gold into the form of a calf, an act expressly prohibited. Subsequently, they engaged in lascivious celebrations, venerating the idol, which also involved indulgent eating, drinking, and revelry. God then told Moses to descend immediately because the people whom Moses had led out of Egypt had degenerated. They had swiftly deviated from God's directives, crafting and worshiping a golden calf and declaring it their liberator from Egypt. Exodus 32:7-8. Upon descending, Moses, joined by Joshua, confronted the people amidst their hedonistic and idolatrous festivities. In a display of righteous fury, he shattered the stone tablets, the physical embodiment of the law, as a symbolic repudiation of the people's transgressions. Exodus 32:31-34. Moses then approached God, admitting the grave sin the people had committed by creating golden idols. He pleaded for their forgiveness, or failing that, requested his own erasure from the divine ledger. God responded by stating that those who had sinned would be removed from his book, and instructed Moses to continue leading the people, promising divine retribution at the appointed time. Despite the gravity of their sin, Moses sought not to mitigate the seriousness of their actions, but to appeal for divine clemency and grace. Moses implored God to forgive Israel, deeply identifying himself with the sinful populace. If forgiveness was denied, Moses requested to be condemned as a sacrificial offering for his people. Moses believed that the enormity of Israel's sin was such that no animal sacrifice could suffice. It required a human to bear their sins. Thus, he was willing to have his name erased from God's book if it could somehow redeem them. God declined Moses' plea, but this moment foreshadowed the eventual sacrifice of someone greater than Moses, someone who would provide complete and ultimate atonement. This figure, Jesus, would embody the same sacrificial spirit when he died for humanity's sins. Although God chose to spare the nation, he retained the authority to judge individual sinners. He then commanded Moses to continue leading the people to the designated place, promising to stay faithful to Israel and to ensure his presence would accompany them, with his angel going ahead. Secondly, the story of Moses and the idol of Nehushtan is recounted in the biblical books of Kings. The image, a serpent wrapped around a pole, is mentioned in the book of Numbers. After their liberation from Egypt, the Israelites complained about their living conditions, prompting God to send fiery serpents among them, resulting in many deaths. In response to Moses' prayers, God instructed that a bronze serpent be erected on a pole, promising that anyone who looked upon it would be cured of their snakebite. Over time, the Israelites started to venerate this bronze serpent. The worship of Nehushtan persisted until the time of Hezekiah's reforms, although it might have begun earlier. In 2 Kings 18:4, during his campaign against idolatry, Hezekiah demolished the places of pagan worship, destroyed sacred stones, cut down Asherah poles, and shattered the bronze serpent Moses had made, because the Israelites had been burning incense to it, referring to it as Nehushtan, a term simply meaning a piece of bronze. This episode illustrates how objects associated with divine miracles can become idols, despite this being a clear violation of God's commandments. The bronze serpent was initially a divine method of deliverance during the crisis described in Numbers 21, without any intention of it being worshipped thereafter. It is plausible that Hezekiah named it Nehushtan to emphasize that it was merely a piece of bronze, devoid of any inherent power. In the episode detailed in Numbers 21, it was God who healed, not the object Nehushtan. This serves as an important reminder that even beneficial things and revered individuals can become objects of idolatry. Our worship, praise, and gratitude should be exclusively directed towards God, as nothing else, regardless of its storied past, merits such devotion. Thirdly, the reason God nearly killed Moses during the burning bush incident is tied to a critical lesson about obedience. God had chosen Moses to rescue the Israelites from Egyptian bondage and guide them to the promised land of Canaan. Known also as the lawgiver and mediator of the Old Covenant, Moses' call to leadership occurred at the burning bush, marking a pivotal moment in his life. God promised him deliverance of his people and prosperity in a new land. After spending 40 years in Midian, Moses, under God's instruction, headed back to Egypt with his wife Zipporah and sons Gershom and Eleazar. However, before Moses could fulfill his role as a deliverer, he needed to adhere to God's commands himself. He neglected to circumcise his son, either Gershom or Eleazar, which might have been due to Zipporah's resistance, Exodus 4:24-26. This oversight led to a perilous situation during their journey when God sought to take Moses' life. Zipporah intervened by performing the circumcision herself, throwing the foreskin at Moses' feet and exclaiming him to be a bridegroom of blood, thereby saving his life. The text does not explicitly state Moses' misstep in Exodus 4:24-26, but the context suggests that Moses had disregarded the crucial rite of circumcision, potentially influenced by his Midianite family's aversion to the practice. Zipporah's actions and her reaction indicate that she believed this act of compliance with the covenant ritual spared her husband from divine wrath. Moses had thus initially failed to uphold God's directive, yet God conveyed to Moses that he doesn't choose just anyone. He chooses those who are holy and blameless. We understand that we are not inherently holy and blameless, being justified only through Christ. Nevertheless, this doesn't permit us to continue sinning under the assumption that grace will simply increase. Moses was preparing to return and act as God's representative, yet he had failed to uphold the righteous standards expected of such a position, even within his own family. Therefore, God intended to end Moses' life. God's judgments are stern because he emphasizes that he is not a deity to be taken lightly. As the intended deliverer, Moses needed to rectify aspects of his personal conduct that were misaligned as God maintains his holiness. This standard of judgment extended to the Israelites too, illustrating that God does not employ a corrupt people to judge others. Moses was deemed unfit to serve as a spiritual leader due to his unresolved sins, which needed addressing before he could adequately execute his duties. Once Zipporah performed the necessary act, God spared Moses. In essence, God was prepared to terminate Moses as he was teaching but concurrently breaching God's law. Regarding the fourth point, Moses was not allowed to enter the Promised Land, and at first glance, the punishment might not appear commensurate with the offense. Moses' action of striking a rock in the wilderness out of frustration with the Israelites might seem too slight an infraction to justify such a severe consequence, especially considering his historical achievements like leading Israel out of Egypt and delivering the 10 Commandments. However, the incident at Meribah, where Moses struck the rock, prevented him from entering the land that God had promised to Israel. The Israelites had voiced their complaints about the lack of water and tested the Lord, leading Moses to seek God's guidance. God instructed Moses to gather the elders of Israel, take his staff, and strike the rock at Horeb to produce water for the people, which Moses did, resulting in water flowing from the rock. Exodus 17:4-6. Now consider the second incident at Meribah, where Moses acted out of frustration and disobeyed God. Numbers 20. When the Israelites, yet again facing a water crisis in the desert of Zin near Kadesh, complained to Moses, it mirrored the previous scenario. However, Moses' response this time deviated from God's specific instructions, leading to significant consequences. In the first month of the 40th year after their departure from Egypt, the Israelites were residing in Kadesh. It was here that Miriam passed away and was buried. At that time, there was a scarcity of water, which led the congregation to confront Moses and Aaron in frustration. The people lamented, expressing regret that they hadn't perished alongside their fellow Israelites in earlier tragedies, questioning Moses on why he had led them into such a barren wilderness to die, along with their livestock. They criticized the decision to leave Egypt for a land that lacked basic provisions like grain, figs, vines, or pomegranates, and most critically, water. In response, Moses and Aaron retreated from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and prayed, prostrating themselves. The glory of the Lord then appeared to them, and God instructed Moses to take his staff and, alongside Aaron, to assemble the congregation. They were to speak to a rock in view of the people to make it yield water, which would provide for them and their animals. Following God's instructions, Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence and gathered the people before the rock. However, in his address to the assembly, Moses expressed frustration, calling them rebels, and questioning if he must bring forth water from the rock. Instead of speaking to the rock as commanded, Moses struck it twice with his staff, causing water to gush out, providing ample for the congregation and their animals. Despite the miracle, God reprimanded Moses and Aaron for their lack of faith and failure to uphold his sanctity in front of the Israelite children. As a result, God decreed that neither would lead the congregation into the Promised Land. This event came to be known as the Waters of Meribah, where the Israelites disputed with the Lord, yet he was glorified among them. Despite Moses' previous steadfastness in following God's directives, this incident highlighted a significant lapse. At a glance, it might seem as though God's punishment of Moses was severe, particularly given Moses' long-standing fidelity. However, understanding the symbolism is crucial. The first striking of the rock represents Christ, as illustrated in 1 Corinthians 10:1-5, which speaks of the Israelites drinking from a spiritual rock that accompanied them, identified as Christ. In this light, Moses' actions in Numbers 20, striking the rock twice rather than speaking to it as commanded, took on profound theological implications, suggesting why God could not simply overlook this error. In Exodus 17, the Lord directed Moses to strike the rock, establishing a symbolic representation of Christ as our Redeemer. Christ is depicted as our foundational rock, who was struck to usher forth the living waters, a theme echoed in Psalms and Isaiah. Additionally, the book of Hebrews emphasizes that Christ's death was a singular, sufficient sacrifice for sin, negating the need for further offerings. Thus, in the incident at Exodus 17, God intended for Moses to strike the rock once, symbolizing the singular sacrifice of Jesus for our salvation. Later, in Numbers 20, God's command was for Moses to speak to the rock, maintaining the symbolism established in Exodus 17. However, Moses' decision to strike the rock again altered this intended image, potentially confusing the faithful with the notion that Christ might need to be sacrificed repeatedly. God's correction of Moses by denying him entry into the Promised Land was to clarify this theological point, ensuring the correct understanding of the rock's symbolism. It underscored that salvation, figuratively represented by entry into the Promised Land, cannot be achieved through adherence to the law alone, symbolized by Moses, but through faith in the work of Jesus, represented by Joshua, whose name is Hebrew for Jesus. When Moses struck the rock out of anger rather than speaking to it as commanded, it led to his exclusion from the Promised Land, highlighting the necessity of responding to God's instructions with obedience rather than emotion. The fifth point discusses the magicians Moses encountered, namely Jannes and Jambres, as mentioned in the narrative of Pharaoh's court, found in Exodus 7 and 8. When Moses and Aaron challenged Pharaoh to release the Israelites from bondage, they demonstrated God's power through miracles. Moses occupies a unique place in history, celebrated for the vast array of miraculous acts attributed to him. These acts confirmed his unparalleled power and authority, marking him as a prophet without equal in Israel, a distinction emphasized in the recounting of all the mighty deeds and great awe inspired by his actions. Though Israel had many great rulers, leaders, prophets, and priests, before the arrival of Jesus Christ, known as the Messiah, no one held all these roles with as much distinction as Moses. Even amidst the remarkable miracles performed by Moses, he encountered resistance from the magicians Jannes and Jambres. God directed Moses and Aaron to make a persuasive demonstration before Pharaoh during their initial meeting. Aaron was to cast down his staff, which God knew would prompt Pharaoh to request a sign. Upon doing so, Aaron's staff transformed into a serpent. This act was immediately countered by Pharaoh's magicians, who with their own enchantments replicated the transformation with their staffs. However, Aaron's serpent consumed those of the magicians, serving as a portentous sign to Pharaoh's court. As recorded in Exodus 7, 8, 13, God instructed Moses and Aaron on how to respond if Pharaoh demanded a miraculous proof of their authority. They were to tell Aaron to throw his staff before Pharaoh to become a serpent. Following these divine instructions, Aaron performed this act in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and his staff indeed became a serpent. In response, Pharaoh summoned his wise men and sorcerers, skilled in magical arts and divination. They mimicked this feat using their occult practices, turning their staffs into serpents as well. But Aaron's staff ultimately swallowed theirs. Despite this, Pharaoh's heart remained unyielding, just as the Lord had predicted. Pharaoh's magicians managed to replicate the initial signs performed by Moses and Aaron a few more times. For instance, the first plague that Moses called upon Egypt was the plague of blood. The magicians similarly turned water to blood, mimicking Moses' act with the Nile River, as described in Exodus 7:19, 22. During this plague, God commanded Moses to instruct Aaron to stretch out his hand with the staff over the waters of Egypt, its rivers, canals, ponds, and all reservoirs, to turn them into blood. This would result in blood throughout all of Egypt, even in wooden and stone vessels. Moses and Aaron did as commanded. Aaron struck the water of the Nile, causing all the water to turn to blood, leading to the death of fish and making the water undrinkable due to the foul odor, which pervaded the entirety of Egypt. However, the magicians of Egypt responded to each plague with their occult practices, which only served to harden Pharaoh's heart further, as God had foretold. This behavior reflects a grave error on the part of the magicians. Despite the plagues being divine punishments, rather than seeking to mitigate these afflictions, they exacerbated them. For instance, when water was turned into blood, they chose to transform additional water into blood, compounding the curse upon their own people. This approach highlights the destructive nature of dark arts, prioritizing the demonstration of power over the well-being of the people they were meant to serve. This misguided perspective failed to offer any relief to the suffering Egyptians. The second plague introduced a swarm of frogs, and yet again, the magicians intensified the crisis by summoning more frogs, worsening the situation rather than providing relief. Eventually, the magicians' ability to mimic the plagues ceased, and they acknowledged the divine origin of these occurrences, admitting to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God," Exodus 8:19. Despite their recognition of God's power, Pharaoh's heart remained unyielding, in line with God's predictions. The capability of Pharaoh's magicians to replicate some of the miracles performed by Moses and Aaron raises questions about their source of power. Although significantly weaker than God, Satan, once one of God's highest angels, can still deceive, imitate miraculous acts, and forecast events with some accuracy. Ultimately, God's power prevailed, as evidenced when the sorcerers failed to produce lice, marking a clear demonstration of God's superior strength, which easily overcame Satan's machinations. The activities of these magicians, powered by dark forces and their acceptance as genuine, are indicative of the type of deception expected in the end times. Just as the influence of Jannes and Jambres had its limits, so too does Satan's power, even in the latter days. Nonetheless, God remains sovereign, offering hopeful victory through Jesus. While miracles might indicate supernatural intervention, they do not necessarily validate the truth. The Egyptian magicians were undoubtedly intelligent and well-learned men, but their abilities were ultimately inadequate against the divine power of God. Paul noted that despite their abilities, these individuals lacked the divine wisdom that only comes from God. Many of us are captivated by any display of spiritual power, often failing to scrutinize whether its origins are sinister rather than divine. Even when a new power appears to provide the answers we seek, we must resist being enticed by it, as demonic entities can masquerade as angels of light. The sixth point to consider is that Moses is the only man whom God personally buried. The details surrounding Moses' death are largely undisclosed by Scripture. Moses ascended from the plains of Moab to the summit of Mount Nebo, specifically to the top of Pisgah, which overlooks Jericho. From there, the Lord allowed him to view the entire land, from Gilead to Dan, covering all of Naphtali, the territories of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah extending to the western sea, the Mediterranean, the Negev, and the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, up to Zoar. Moses is honorably remembered as Jehovah's servant, a title that he embodied throughout his life by diligently following God's commands as a servant awaits his master's instructions. His dedication to God was evident in his unwavering respect for God's name, his steadfast loyalty to God's cause, and his firm belief in God's word. Yet, even as a devoted servant, Moses had to face mortality. Although most men die, only 2 in Scripture bypass death to enter glory directly. Moses was not one of them. At the end of his life, God allowed Moses to see the promised land from Mount Nebo, a vista for which he had left Egypt. This mountain symbolizes a passage that we all must eventually face, transitioning to join our ancestors. We should aspire to ascend with the same readiness as Moses, the servant of God. The circumstances of his death are notably extraordinary, occurring at the remarkable elevation of approximately 1,370 meters on Mount Pisgah, nearly a mile high. It's uncommon to find a 120-year-old man who can ascend a mountain nearly a mile high and live to share his experience. Yet Moses did exactly that. He managed the climb without the need for a wide trail, proving that his physical condition was remarkably robust. Here was Moses, well into his 120s, energetically reaching the summit of a 370-meter peak and thoroughly enjoying the view from the top. Moses, the man of God, stood alone at the mountain's summit with the promised land spread out before him. His impending death was not a shock. It had been foretold, and Moses had long been aware that he would not enter Canaan. He was well prepared for his departure, accepting it with a sense of completion and fulfillment of his divine mission. Rather than bemoaning his fate, Moses embraced it, showing neither complaint nor resistance. His death marked the culmination of his life's work, having successfully led his people through the wilderness. Moreover, Moses died in perhaps the best company possible, with God himself. While many find their final moments surrounded by family, Moses had no direct kin to close his eyes. Instead, he departed this world exactly as God had ordained. Moses lived a full 120 years without the need for glasses or crutches, never relegated to a rocking chair with liniment and dietary supplements. But Deuteronomy 34:6 offers a particularly extraordinary note on his remarkable life, stating that God personally buried him in a location unknown to anyone. This secrecy was intentional. Had his burial site been known, it might have become a place of pilgrimage, complete with commercial exploitation and idolatrous veneration. Thus, it was crucial for the Lord to conceal his grave, which even led to an angelic dispute. This confrontation involved none other than Michael the archangel, who argued with the devil over Moses' body, an episode uniquely recounted in the book of Jude. Here, Jude reveals a remarkable event not documented elsewhere in the scriptures. Michael, contending with the devil, refrained from harsh accusations, instead invoking a rebuke from the Lord against Satan. This incident underscores the significance and sanctity of Moses' final resting place. The question naturally emerges about the origins of Jude's account regarding the dispute between Michael the archangel and Satan over Moses' body. Some suggest that this information was handed down through tradition, though there is no conclusive evidence to support this theory. The reasons behind the dispute remain unclear, but it's plausible that Satan desired to locate Moses' body to create a shrine, which Michael, adhering to divine command, countered with a mere declaration of the Lord's rebuke, rather than passing judgment himself. Despite his immense power, Michael shows complete deference to God. This act illustrates that true submission does not diminish one's strength, purpose, or value. Michael's submission, especially given his status and power, underscores a beautiful aspect of angelic hierarchy and obedience. Michael the archangel is mentioned again in Revelation 12:7 during a pivotal scene where Satan is cast out of heaven. This confrontation, though often unwelcome, is deemed necessary for correction, purification, and unity within the community. The ninth notable point involves Moses' encounter with Jesus during the transfiguration, a critical event documented in all the gospel accounts. Here, Jesus brings Peter, James, and John to a high mountain where he is miraculously transformed, his face shining like the sun and his clothes turning dazzling white. Matthew 17:2. This event not only signifies Jesus' divine nature, but also his fulfillment of God's kingdom on earth. At the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah appear alongside Jesus, symbolizing the law and the prophets respectively, bearing witness to Jesus as the Messiah who fulfills the Old Testament. Moses, revered as a great leader and lawgiver, and Elijah, seen as a bridge between the non-literary and literary prophets, together underscore Jesus' preeminence. The presence of Moses and Elijah highlights Jesus' majestic role as the Son of God, who surpasses both. Their appearance with Jesus on the mountain underscores his role as the definitive prophet, fulfilling what Moses had prophesied. Furthermore, Jesus' fulfillment of both the law and the prophets is emblematic of his divine mission, which Moses and Elijah's revelations pointed towards. When the disciples eventually see only Jesus, their focus shifts entirely to him, aligning with Moses and Elijah's roles in heralding the coming of the Messiah. This pivotal moment on the mountain demonstrates that all prior revelations were intended to prepare the way for Jesus, affirming his identity as the Son of God and his redemptive mission. Despite receiving a clear revelation of Jesus' identity, the disciples still struggled to fully grasp the magnitude of what they had seen. In the 10th narrative, Moses' profound encounters with God are highlighted. Moses first met God at the burning bush, saw God's power over Pharaoh and the Egyptians, witnessed the parting of the sea, and received water from a rock. He also spent 40 days and nights on Mount Sinai in God's presence. Having experienced these miraculous signs and wonders, Moses yearned for a deeper, more personal connection with God. He valued this relationship above all miraculous deeds and divine gifts, understanding that truly knowing God is the ultimate blessing any person can attain, as stated in John 17:3, which defines eternal life as knowing the only true God and Jesus Christ, whom he has sent. In response to Moses' longing to know who would accompany him, God assured him, "My presence will go with you," affirming the close relationship and favor Moses had with the Lord. Moses, despite his close relationship with God, found himself yearning for even more intimacy and understanding. Having experienced miraculous events such as the burning bush, the parting of the Red Sea, the miraculous provision of water from a rock, and manna from heaven, these wonders had become familiar to him. He longed to delve deeper into the nature of God, prompting him to ask the Lord, "Please show me your ways, that I may know you." This request was akin to a man, hungry for a meal, who is not content with just appetizers, but desires to savor the full banquet of what the Lord could reveal. Moses echoed the sentiment of the psalmist, "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God." Psalms 42:1-2. This deep spiritual longing is what God seeks, not mere attendance from those who are casually involved with church, but a heartfelt pursuit of Him by those who truly desire to know Him. Then, in a profound expression of his longing, Moses requested, "Now show me your glory." Exodus 33:18. He sought not just to know about God, but to witness a visible display of God's divine nature. Moses' desire was to see the glory of the invisible God made manifest, a tangible demonstration of His divine presence. He questioned whether one could be content with merely listening to sermons and singing hymns, or whether a deeper, continuous yearning to experience more of God's glory was necessary. Encouraged by this insatiable desire, Moses made a bold request, "Show me your glory." In response, God agreed to renew His covenant with Israel, showing mercy and compassion. He outlined how He would reveal His glory to Moses in a way that would preserve Moses' life. God explained that while His back could be seen, His face could not, for no one could see God's face and live. This arrangement was detailed in Exodus 33:19-23, where God promised to pass by Moses, who would stand in a cleft of the rock, covered by God's hand until he had passed, allowing Moses to see his back, but not his face. This extraordinary encounter was a testament to God's willingness to meet the deep longings of those who earnestly seek Him. Essentially, the Lord restricted Moses' exposure to His glory to protect him. Moses could only endure a limited glimpse from behind, not a full view of God's glory. Despite this restricted view, the experience was so profound that Moses' face radiated with the glow of having been in God's presence. This phenomenon underscored the holiness of his interaction with the Lord. It's important to note that because God is a spirit, He does not have a physical body and thus does not literally have a back or an arm. No one has seen God in His full glory. However, Jesus, the Son of God, has made Him known. As Jesus explained to His disciples, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." John 14:9. Until we see God face to face, we continue to live by faith. If you found this discussion enriching, I encourage you to support our content by subscribing. This way you won't miss any of our forthcoming videos, and together we can continue to enlighten and expand our collective understanding. Thank you for joining us, and may God bless you.